So, with that in mind, we mentioned at the beginning that we'd like to have sort of a conversation with you guys about one of these 10 games. I hope can you all see them fairly well up there?
I'll rattle off the titles,
yeah,
if
sure.
you can't. Okay, friends. Yeah, this is going to be the more interactive part. First, thank you so much for listening and staying with us so far. We're excited now to actually talk through whether or not one of these games belongs in the video game canon with you. So we're going to do some voting. I'm going to list off the names of these if you can't see them, and then go to the link on your mobile device or what have you, and you can vote for one. And through the power of democracy, we will decide which game we'll be talking about. So, the games are Legend of Zelda, Skyward Sword, Darksiders the First, Bioshock Infinite, Bloodborne, Xenoblade Chronicles the First, Sonic the Hedgehog the First. Wow, for Xenoblade Chronicles? That's awesome. Sonic the Hedgehog the First, Mass Effect the Third, Dark Souls 2, The Witcher 3, and Portal the First.
Woo!
So go to vote. If you have other PAXing to do, we totally get that. This would be the opportunity to slip out if you want before the discussion. But the discussion is going to be awesome, so I invite you to stick around. If you're heading out, thank you so much for coming. I'll close the poll in like a minute, and we'll figure out what game we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. Give us a little longer.
If it doesn't load, we're going to just do some laser point trickery here. So.
Okay.
Yeah, we can also just do it by show of hands if it's not loaded.
Like that.
Also, if you have any more general sort of Q&A, we'll be over in that hallway after the panel. So if you have anything not related to the discussion, we'd be happy to ask.
Yeah, but if you do go to the Q&A mic for the next part of this, we ask that it's for part of the discussion, not for Q&A about what we just said. So is the poll not working for a lot of people?
Yeah.
I'm not loading.
Loading.
All right, we can do show.
We'll just do show of hands. It'll be great.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So, Skyward Sword. Any takers?
The low-tech approach. Skyward Sword.
Anyone? Okay, couple. Darksiders.
Darksiders.
More than I expected. Bioshock.
Bioshock Infinite.
Ready? Oh no, that's a one. Bloodborne.
Okay. Bloodborne.
Whoop.
Xenoblade Chronicles.
Xenoblade Chronicles.
Nice. Sonic. Really? I'm surprised, Sonic guys in the back.
The Sonic head didn't raise their hand? Oh my god!
That was 2 of 5, guys. Well, we know where you stand. Mass Effect 3.
ME3.
Dark Souls 2.
Dark Souls 2. Few hands.
The Witcher 3.
Witcher 3.
And Portal.
Portal.
All right, it looks like between Portal and Bioshock to me. Yeah, we'll do, all right, we're gonna do Bioshock. What do we say?
Bioshock versus Portal. This is for Bioshock.
Yep, okay. And Portal. I think Portal has it.
I think some people were double raising their hands. Cheating democracy at its finest. All right, the way this is going to work, again, we want it to be super discussion-based, and we don't want to be talking that much at all. So what we're going to do is people who have Portal, feel free to line up at the talkback mic. We've prepared a few thoughts on Portal that we're going to talk through just as people, ready their questions, their thoughts. So feel free to line up as we're talking. We're going to say a little spiel about Portal, and then hopefully most of it will just be you guys offering points, and we'll say like, oh, that's a good point. We'll steal that. And not contributing much of our own. Dan, you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so for me, when it comes to Portal, I think it's a fantastic game. I don't think that's going to break any new ground by saying that. I wouldn't put it in the canon, though, because I think that the first game, in particular, it's a very good puzzle game, and it keeps with Gladys's lines of dialogue, keeps alluding to sort of subverting some sort of puzzle game narrative, but really at its heart, it's just a puzzle game. And you're not expecting, I mean, at the end of Portal, what are you expecting? Like more puzzles? Or the end kick, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm tired of it. But so I think that it offers, it like cues itself up for commentary and subversion, but it doesn't quite drive it home, and you just kind of get that end boss fight with Gladys at the end as you're running through the tunnels and you get to that point, which I think is fun. But I would say that all of the sort of questions that it cues up in that first game, or all of those commentary subversions that it's trying to take, like games in general, show up in the second one beautifully, where it turns out this idea of the meta-narrative of you're playing a game, right? It's a game to Gladys too, and you find out that she's actually addicted to it. And like Wheatley, when he gets into the Gladys seat, it's way worse because he doesn't know how to handle it. And it just kind of offers a little bit more in terms of what I think the first one was trying to get at. So that's where I stand on it. Aaron, do you have any?
Yeah. I'll say one thing procedurally too. If we run through this and everyone has said their piece and there's still time, we'll jump to another one of the most popular games. So we will keep you guys entertained for the whole hour. What I would add to Portal is just it's not even a comment on whether or not it belongs in the canon, but one thing that I think is really interesting to pay attention to, not just in this case, but in a variety of the games that we were thinking about and talking about, is the degree to which sequels or other parts of a game series can change your perspective on it. So Dan alluded to this a bit with the sequel to Portal 2 really changing how he viewed the original game and how he thought of its overall quality. I think that's pretty common, and since Dark Souls 2 only had a few fans, I'll just say my piece on that because I think it's relevant. I think one of the really interesting things to me about Dark Souls 2 is that it shows how much a game can be transformed by the addition of another story or more content. Because when I played Dark Souls 2, the original, I thought, wow, this is a really garbage game. Then Scholar of the First Sin came out, and I said to myself, oh wow, the problem isn't that the game is terrible, the original Dark Souls. The problem is that it was unfinished. And so my evaluation of the game actually changed based on the new content that was added. And I think Portal could at least be read as another example of this, where the incredible success and added thematic commentary of the second game can really change, as it has for Dan, how you think about the first game. So that's my comment, just a thought. But let's turn it over to you, sir.
Do I just make comments about it or ask you questions?
Anything you feel like if you have a comment like, oh, I think this is a really cool aspect of the game, or if you have a question you want our take on it, anything you want.
So, my thing about Portal is...
Sorry, I think we gotta turn the mic on. There should be a button on it.
All right. Yeah?
No?
Yeah. Yes,
Whoa.
there you go.
Okay. My thing about Portal is it's a 3-hour game, and in those 3 hours, I wanted everything to do with aperture science. Like, I wanted to know everything about it, how it got to the position, like to the state it was in, how like the character of GLaDOS and how she became that, where she started from. We get all that, but we get all that in the sequel, which you mentioned. But like, the addictive thing about it for me is that in 3 hours, it made me care about it. Like, if it weren't, in the sequel you get it, and that's part of what makes the sequel so good as well. But it wouldn't matter if I got that in the sequel if I didn't care so much about finding out about it in the first game. And world building to me is such a huge part of why I play games. I tend to play a lot of JRPGs for that, but like Portal in 3 hours was able to do and make me care about this world that some JRPGs can't do in 50 hours. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits as to Portal, and kind of why I would put it in that, because it's incredible to me.
That's a really good point, the draw of intrigue when you're playing a game, because the thing about Portal is that the gameplay is so tight and good that you're kind of like, all right, that's squared away, right? we don't have to worry about that. So you're looking at the world and trying to figure out sort of the mysteries. So I'm with you on that point. I think my issue with that kind of thing is it's sort of like it sort of makes it so that, oh, this is meant to have a sequel. And that's not always bad, because obviously Portal 2 was great, right? Yeah, that's my thought on that kind of take. But I love the intrigue bit. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So my name is Austin,
Hi, Austin.
and I think in regards to Portal's story, because it is such a short game, I think people take story beats from it, such as the cake at the end, the companion cube, and say, oh, it's got a good story because it has these elements of what could make a good story. But really, Portal's achievement is gameplay. At the end of the day, it's it's foundational and completely groundbreaking in puzzle first-person platformers. But as for the actual story of the game, it doesn't quite hit the mark, in my opinion. Like, as if we're talking about the story.
So let me ask you something just to probe your brain a little bit. Have you played the original Bioshock?
I have not.
Okay. Do you know the story of the original Bioshock?
I don't.
It's okay.
So am I way off?
I don't want to spoil it for you, but I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Do you have a couple hours?
Really quick.
Let me step back and ask my question in much more general terms that people who've played the original Bioshock will immediately understand. There are some stories, not just in video games, but quite generally, right, where people will talk about it just for a single moment in the story, right, and say, wow, that moment was incredible. And if you ask them about the overall plot of the story, they might not even remember it, right? So I'm just interested in this idea you have about just remembering beats. Do you think that there are games and stories in which a singular beat can make it a good story, or do you think it really has to have a complete and fulfilling arc for it to count as a good story?
Well, because the companion cube, at least, it's kind of a self-contained story in itself. It's just like, oh, there was a person in this box, and now I've killed them. Oh, that's a sad story within itself. But as for the overarching story of the game itself, it doesn't contribute anything, I don't think.
I would say, yeah, so this runs into an issue that we talk about a lot, which is sort of if there's like a bit of an implied narrative in something, we also try to shy away from that because if it's not making a broader point in the game, then from a narrative storytelling perspective, we try to kind of get away from that. That's sort of like when you talk about like lore theory, that kind of thing. We don't really look at that for the canon because it's really interesting to talk about, but at the end of the day, like I think that extrapolation is kind of a huge problem when it comes to like building a story. And so I would counter though that the whole sequence of the companion cube does speak to the broader narrative of Gladys just likes messing with you. And the people who, and you could sort of take that and say, people who make games like messing with people who play them. And that I think is lovely. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Henry. So I guess one first point I want to make about Portal is that we're talking about a canon and that these are something that you should play in order to understand the way games tell stories. And so for Portal, I think one thing important about the way it tells the story is that first off, it wasn't originally sold by itself. It was something that came with the orange box. It wasn't the headline. And then you just find this game, you're like, oh, I guess I'll play it. And then there's this unique story in there. And what I think is unique about Portal is that the way it doesn't force you to ingest the story. You get the story if you want to, and you get it through gameplay. Like, for example, the famous Cake is a Lie thing. You get in there by solving a puzzle, and you find a secret room, and you find out I'm not the first person who's happened to. There's other people that have been involved with this. And so you're kind of the thing with the companion cube. You can kind of figure out through inference that there's a person here, and so that's something that you couldn't really do with like a movie. Like in a movie, in order to know that there was other people, you have to either be told or shown through media, hey, this is a room where other people have been tested on and stuff like that. But you can kind of figure that out through the gameplay. And I think if I was someone who had never played puzzle games before, and they say, hey, what's a good game to find out how puzzle games tell a story? And I would say, well, this is a game that kind of changed the way we look at how puzzle games can tell a story. So that's my 2 cents in that.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I like what you said at the end where you said, how does a puzzle game tell a story? Which is another angle to take these articles where it's sort of like, all right, well, this is a puzzle game. Does it tell a story? Actually, it does. Well, how does it do that, right? And that's interesting in and of itself. And I like that a couple of people are hitting on the fact that it originally came in the orange box. And that is sort of like a weird, it's not multimedia because it's all one thing. but it does kind of have this allusion to older days where you would get like a point and click game and it had a book that came with it, right? And that kind of thing. Or yeah, a B-side to a record. That's maybe a better example. So yeah, do you have anything? Nope. Yep. Thanks very much.
Point,
Yeah, that was great.
Hi. Hello. I'm Brent. I have a confession to make. I actually triple voted.
For Portal?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Bloodborne and Dark Souls.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
But there's a connecting thing between all those, and it was the feeling of you going in and you mentioned extrapolation. That kind of hit a thing with me because you in order to understand at least 100% the lore of all three of those games, you have to go in and actively hunt things, either by, of course, the Ratman Day. And I feel like it's impossible to talk about Portal without talking about Portal 2, because that's just that on a much grander scale. You do the same in Bloodborne and in Dark Souls via item descriptions or clever placement of things in the environment. I'm kind of disappointed Fallout Vegas was not up there. It's basically in that same.
Stay tuned.
That same, it's basically in that same thing, and those types of games just kind of almost literally engrave yourself into that whole hero's journey, much more literally than say Ocarina of Time, where it's just kind of, I won't say force-fed, but given to you. The allure of you being able to go out and hunt the story out yourself really hits a note with me, and that was the reason I triple voted. So
we won't hold it against you. Okay.
And you can boo and hiss for all that, but first let me say the games I'm about to mention terrible. Five Nights at Freddy's.
Yeah, we agree.
Yeah. But there is a story behind it that you had to hunt for. And yes, it was totally kind of added on as you went, but in the same way of you trying to hunt that down by unlocking things or whichever, pressing buttons on a wall randomly, you still get that kind of feeling of, oh, I'm going out hunting for the lore and actually looking for the story. Okay, forget Five Nights at Freddy's now. But
I can't.
There's no case.
No, I like. So you hit on something. I have an article on Five Nights at Freddy's.
The most scathing canon article.
I will go and read it. It's probably the best
vitriol. Just the first one, though. But I think you hit on something that we would have talked about in the Dark Souls 2 one if we had done that. And we've written a little bit on the site about sort of putting together the narrative of the game as you go through it, trying to find it. And I would agree that Portal does that to an extent. I'd have to think more on it, though. You guys are kind of turning me. You've made a lot of good points. So this is why we like to do this. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to think more on it. If you want to talk later, we can. Aaron?
I think the interesting thing to me about Portal in this sense of exploration, that kind of goes even beyond the Soulsborne games, is that there's this question, right, when you think about the unique ability of video games to tell stories, right, versus novels or films. And the question is, can you really tell a story through just gameplay, right? And Portal to me is almost like a real live example to explore that. There's a little bit of explicit narrative, stuff like the cake and GLaDOS talking to you and whatnot, but it's pretty close to as close as you can get, right? It's almost entirely gameplay, and yet you do get a really interesting story out of that gameplay. So I would have to think more about it too, but I think it's super interesting for that reason, yeah. Maybe even goes beyond one Souls for that.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, I have to adjust this because I'm really short. So I have, I'm Andy, and I have 2 points to make. One, I love the idea of the canon and the idea of arguing over whether or not you look at a work as an individual object or within the context of all works surrounding it, or in this case, it's sequels. In which case, you think about arguments like people who consider like The Godfather Part 2 to be better than The Godfather, does that invalidate The Godfather's status as a canon work? And I think a lot of people, even people who would prefer Godfather Part 2, to argue against that and say that the original Godfather is a canon work within film. I'm not comparing Portal to The Godfather. I'm definitely
Wish it would.
it is, no, it's not. I would say, and I'm not even sure if I consider Portal to be a canon work. I feel like its closest comparison to a work in another medium, I would say, is The Dark Knight, and I'm going to make my point here, is that neither of them have a very compelling plot, but they have interesting stories created by a compelling central character. In which case, the GLaDOS and the Joker. I'm sorry, guys, The Dark Knight is not that good of a movie. Sorry.
It's a strange soapbox to stand on.
Sorry, Christopher Nolan fans.
Is he here?
So neither of these have particularly compelling plots. It's kind of point A, point B, point C. But they have compelling stories because of this central character who brings something interesting for an audience that most audiences have not seen before, that creates a story out of it. In the case of GLaDOS, a character who is so antagonistic towards a central character, which is the player's persona in the game, Shell is purposely given almost nothing so that she's essentially an avatar for you. That GLaDOS's contention and despisal of you really connects.
I think that's the difference between compelling narrative and compelling character. This is a good argument. This game is a really good argument for that. And I think that it's worth it almost as you can almost do a character study on Portal, just of GLaDOS, this unbelievably hate-filled person. Like you have no idea why. It's just, she's so antagonistic towards you. And so that's interesting to think of, just a bad guy who just purely hate, just contempt loaded on you. So maybe that's that. Get to you later in the interest of time.
One of the things that's really interesting to me about that too is I've been thinking a lot about just the nature of series over the last few months, and something that I've talked a lot with Dan about is, what are the different strands you can use to unify different games within the same series, right? So oftentimes you think of a series, right, and you just think of a plot that continues through multiple games, right? But there are also games that just have as a unifying theme a particular place, say Silent Hill. And this is an interesting case, I think, of an instance in which two games are unified, you might say, by a single character. That Portal 1 and Portal 2 are really an exploration of GLaDOS, and that's what unites them. You might argue, and I think that's an interesting way to maybe think about it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hi. Yeah. Hey, my name's Tom.
Hey, Tom.
I wanted to talk about Portal, and I think the way that it succeeds the most is that it ties in gameplay into the story in a way that I think a lot of games fail. Throughout the game, you're solving weird puzzles, and you're using this weird gameplay mechanic of the portal gun, so it makes sense you're in a lab setting, and that someone's sort of talking to you in a sinister way about puzzle solving. So again, what you're doing in the game, during the gameplay, actually makes sense in the context of the story. Whereas, to use an example on the list, BioShock Infinite is a story without spoiling too much about redemption, about finding out the truth about yourself. And the way you do that in the actual gameplay is by shooting people in the face repeatedly and occasionally setting them on fire. So I don't think it ties the gameplay and the story well together the way that Portal, I think, does excellently. I wanted your thoughts on that.
That's a fair point. Booker finds out at the end he just really likes setting people on fire. I think it's certainly, Portal definitely rewards inquisitiveness. I mean, I think obviously through the nature of the puzzles in the games and how you're going about it, and then also clearly from everything that everyone has said, again, returning to the elements, it rewards sort of thinking outside of everything and trying to put together something that might not be there at first glance. So Aaron, what do you think about that, if anything?
No, I think it's great. I'm going to try to move things along in the interest of time so that all you guys can talk. But the one thing I will say that I think your comment picks up on and is totally right is we're really adamant on the site about thinking of gameplay as another element that video games have available to them to tell stories. A lot of people don't think about gameplay that way, and I think a lot of developers still don't think about gameplay that way, and it shows. It shows precisely in the way that you talk about where a lot of games have this striking disconnect between the gameplay, what you're actually doing as a player, and the overall narrative that they're trying to tell. So when there's a game that succeeds at that, like Portal, really bringing them together, I think it's certainly worthwhile. Thank you. Remaining four, if I could ask, keep your comments brief, please, because we have like 3 minutes, and I still want all of you to speak.
Aaron, I had something else, but then while I was in line, you said you thought it did a really great job of merging gameplay and story. And so my question is brief, and it is, if you took out all of Gladys's voiceover, would the gameplay be affected?
No. It would be fun.
If you had only GLaDOS's voice lines as a thing you read, would the story be affected profoundly?
No, you're hitting on very good points here. I would make that argument.
That is the argument that I would make.
Yes, I think you're spot on.
I think that's right.
Yep.
Yep.
Excellent.
Great point.
Yeah.
No argument.
Hi. My name's Nick, and I agree with a lot of what people have already said about, beat points and whatnot. The question I really have is, games allow us to be participants in the story. So when we ask, is it a good story? Well, whose story? My story? The person who made the game story? So for me, yes, if I just took Portal for what it was, but because I was so involved in it, I wanted to go through it. I personally felt what it felt like to put my friendly cube in the fire. And then I was personally wanting to figure out why I had to do this and do these horrible things. And so there is some of that, well, in my story was great. I liked my story.
Sure, and that's sort of the beauty of these games where it is, the silent protagonist, you can kind of construct your own path. We actually, that was our entire panel at PAX West.
It's online, you should watch it.
Talking about that. So we're right there with you. I think the difference is where you get into the nitty-gritty is like BioShock. You're following Booker's story, whereas you're not really following Chell's story. Just as I would argue you're not following Link's story, really, in Ocarina of Time. If anyone, you're following like Zelda's, but it's your experience. So that's sort of a weird line that we find ourselves traversing a lot too, where does the experience come in and where does the narrative of the game come in? So harder to answer in 2 minutes, but if you want to talk after, I'd be happy to.
Thanks a lot. Okay, last two, lightning round.
Yep.
We have 1 minute.
I'll try to be quick. I tend to ramble. My name's Jessica.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Okay, so this is all so interesting, and I love that you guys are talking about it. Because you got me in the beginning thinking there are new stories. No new stories, just new ways of telling old stories. And then I started thinking about, I voted for BioShock. I didn't vote for Portal. And disclaimer, I've never finished Portal 1. I've played all of Portal 2. Yeah.
Gotta finish it.
No. Portal 2, it was interesting. I played it with my husband, and I thought it was a really unique experience because we had the narrative that was in the story, but then we ended up sort of creating our own narrative, our own story outside of that. And really enjoyed that.
Yes,
Yeah, so
I think that's a great point. I want to talk with you about it more, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask if it's okay for this last guy to just say his piece very quickly, and then we'll be out of the room and out of your hair. Thank you.
My name's Zach.
Hi, Zach.
I would like to talk to you guys a little more after, because I was interested to think of, what about spiritual successors? How do they fit in canons? Especially one of the recent issues being, like, I Am Setsuna with Chrono Trigger.
Oh, sure.
Because it doesn't exactly bring a whole lot new to the table, but is it still considered canon?
I have a lot to say about that. There's a Shovel Knight piece coming out soon that talks about that, sort of where spiritual successors fit into these things. I would say that if they're done really well, then yes. They have a lot to offer just because it's sort of like the Apocalypse Now Spec Ops example, taking something that existed and sort of reaffirming it in the canon. So please talk to us after.
PAX South, thank you so much.
Hi there, I'm Dan Hughes of WithTheTerribleFate.com,
and series runner of now loading the video game canon. But you won't know all that because you've seen that video I just posted. Well, we had a great time at PAX South, especially in that discussion that we had there, and we've got a lot of good points for the Portal article that you can now read in the link below. You'll see in it that they really changed my mind, the good people at PAX South, and the caliber of questions and discussion points just blew us all away. So I hope that you enjoy reading the Portal article and see that this really is a collaborative effort, and we all benefit from the deep communal analysis that we really enjoyed having at PAX. If you happen to be in the Boston area, we'll be performing a number of other panels at PAX East, April 5th to 8th, including a version of this Canon panel where we'll be discussing another game for a future article. So if you'd like to take a part in the construction of that future article, come on and see us in Boston. In the meantime, though, enjoy the Portal article and enjoy any number of other great articles on our website, including other Canon pieces and a host of really interesting, deep analytical pieces on a host of games. Alright, so thanks for watching, thanks for reading, and hopefully we'll see you in the future. Have a good one.